Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on building the space economy for commerce and security on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for spending this time with us this morning on what will be a very interesting conversation led by our partner in this effort, Jamil Jaffer, Director of the National Security Institute at George Mason. It's a pleasure for us to have this combination today of discussants from government and the private sector. The center, which is in its 56th year, has made it a priority recently to focus on several key areas of national security interest. We create our agenda together with Chairman Mike Rogers and the leadership of the Mike Rogers Center at CSPC. And its director, Joshua Huminski. And we decided several years ago to focus on the idea of space and national security and endeavor through our convenings and our recommendations to try to help the United States maintain our supremacy, which was rapidly shrinking in the space and national security area over adversaries that were catching up. We have been very pleased over the course of those several years to observe some of the great strengths the United States possesses in this area, a vibrant commercial sector of innovators creating and developing new technologies and bringing capabilities onto the table that the government is able to take advantage of and use. But we also observed several significant points of friction in the interface between the national security architecture of the United States and that burgeoning commercial space sector, and set out as our mission to try to help bridge that gap through convening members of government and the private sector, try to help streamline some of the procurement hurdles that exist, and look at ways that we could recommend further development of the space economy to benefit that end goal of supporting America's national security interests. We're very pleased today to have some amazing speakers. Dr. Diane Howards, Chief Counsel for Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Jeffrey Manber, who's the CEO of NanoRacks. Adrian Mangiuca at Made in Space, Business Development Director for Space Solutions. Victoria Samson, the Washington Office Director for the Secure World Foundation. Some of the participants that have been in our conversations with us as we have built this program all along. And of course, obviously very pleased to have Jamil Jaffer leading the conversation today and helping us unpack what we need to understand about the challenge of building the space economy for commerce and security. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to our partner, Jamil, who will provide further thoughts on what we'd like to accomplish and help us jump right into to our conversation today. Jamil, thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to you and Chairman Rogers for your excellent leadership in creating this partnership between the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress and the National Security Institute at George Mason. We really appreciate the partnership, and we really appreciate all the work that's being done in this space. The idea of creating a commercial environment in space and an opportunity for real economic development is a unique moment that we are in as a nation and as a globe today. And so I'm excited to be in this conversation with such esteemed colleagues. So I'd like to do quick introductions for our panelists and then jump right into questions if that's all right. So Dr. Diane Howards, as the Congressman said, is the Chief Counsel for Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She, in addition to providing space law expertise to the Office of Space Commerce and the Department of Commerce as a whole, she also participates in interagency work and is actively involved in the Office of Space Commerce's implementation of Space Policy Directive 3. Jeffrey Manber is the Chief Executive Officer of NanoRacks. He served as the CEO of NanoRacks from 2009 onwards, and more recently has taken on the role of Chairman of the Board of Exo Markets, the parent company of NanoRacks. Jeffrey has steered the growth of NanoRacks from a garage space in Webster, Texas, to the only commercial space station company with customers. Under Jeffrey's leadership, NanoRacks is a pioneer and now the leader in the commercial market for LEO, low Earth orbit utilization. Adrian Mangiuca, Business Development Director for Space Solutions Made in Space. works in the interface between civilian and defense space infrastructures with a specific focus on commercialization. At MIS, Mangiuca leads the government capture and program strategy for innovative satellite and commercial space architectures. And in his current role, he works to generate value in space through manufacturing enabled satellites and long duration space platforms. Adrian also leverages his experience in space manufacturing and robotic assembly technology to enable BD initiatives in support of complex missions. And last but certainly not least, a good friend and a colleague that I've worked with a lot, Victoria Samson, the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. She has 20 years of experience in military, space, and security issues. Before joining SWF, Victoria served as a senior analyst for the Center for Defense Information, and her expertise, she leverages her expertise in this space, both on missile defense, nuclear reduction, and space security to do in-depth analysis and media commentary on these issues. So look, as we've discussed, for all of you, the space economy, like the global economy, needs rules of the road, right? It needs international norms of behavior, operating agreements, and the like. And so I'd love to start with Diane. Where does the dialogue stand on the creation of these sort of international norms of behavior, these rules of the road? What do we have today, and what's missing in this space?
Well, I think that we have quite a few different platforms where these things are under discussion. I think, they're under discussion and have been for many, many years internationally at COPUOS, but also in Geneva. And also on the domestic level that we have, NGOs like Secure World Foundation. So I think these conversations are occurring in a lot of different places. And I think what's very interesting when you have this kind of top-down and bottom-up hybrid approach is that take a long time because, certainly at the international level, we require consensus, but so too also for a lot of domestic things, we require consensus. And the upside to that process is that a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints surface. And while those things are surfacing, the technological capabilities and also realities continue to evolve. So what you end up with at in middle and toward the end of the process is a lot different than what you might think you're going to start out with, or what you might think you'll end up with when you start the process. So I think that these things are under development. I think there's a benefit to them taking a long time. I think the benefit is that they can be grounded in operational realities, and we are very involved here in the US in particular in regulatory reform so that our norms, the things that are actual hard law requirements, match those right. Operational realities. And I'll stop now.
So, Jeffrey, how do you see this this role that sort of Dr. Howard just pointed out about developing internationals, but also thinking about the regulatory environment domestically? Have you seen sort of a change in the regulatory environment domestically, and is that enabling the kind of moves that we need to have a space economy that's not just frankly space-based, but has a terrestrial component to it?
I mean, we've seen, first off, thank you for having me this morning, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. And plunging right into it, let me say that it's been extraordinary progress has been made in the last decade on having genuine rules of the road that allow space to mature further. And we see that in launch vehicles, we see that in Earth observation. We even see it, we at NanoRacks are focused on the International Space Station. We see it with IP rights, we see it with other things. But having said that, there's no good discussion if we agree on everything. So having said that, let me say that space is perhaps one of the great protectionist markets. And, I've been beating my head against the wall for 15, 20 years on just how protectionist this market is. So, you still have these weird things called space agencies, and these space agencies, of course, cannot do business with anyone outside of their country or their political area. And so we're not close yet to having a true international vibrant market in space, and it really only hurts the purchaser, and that purchaser can be not only commercial, but it's also the governments. So if I want to contribute to the Japanese efforts, or if I want to contribute to the European, forget about it. I mean, there are ways around it, and I know that Made in Space and NanoRacks have set up European subsidiaries, but to answer your question, we've seen extraordinary growth in allowing leveling the playing field and allowing competition to develop as it should. We have a long way to go to remove a lot of protectionist barriers.
Right. Well, Victoria, you've spent a lot of time in this space at the intersection between sort of international issues when it comes to missile development and the like. And now we're talking about space. And I guess what I'm wondering is, Jeffrey's laid out a challenge, right? This idea of protectionism in space. How does secure world play in this space? And is there a way to transition from what's largely been a nation state based system for getting into space and getting satellites on orbit and funding them and the like with national space agencies? Is there a way to transition to a more global market in this arena? Why don't I come back to you while we try to sort that one out? And Adrian, let me pivot to you for a second, if that's all right. And I apologize, Victoria. We'll try and get that thing squared away. So, Adrian, as we were just talking about with Jeffrey, he mentioned that you all Made in Space have set up a European subsidiary, as has NanoRacks. Talk to us about how you see the international environment developing for the space economy, and whether there is an opportunity here to do something more than just a sort of domestic-based situation.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jamil. And I think that Made in Space is, and to be very clear, I don't want to misrepresent myself here. I actually don't interact that much with our European arm. So a lot of what I'm going to say, I might even go and pivot back to Jeff, because a lot of the international stuff I've been working on, comes from the NanoRacks experience. But even in my current role, I'm advocating for looking for business opportunities outside the United States.
Right.
One of the things that hampers us in the space industry is obviously our close consideration of ITAR. We obviously need to be extremely cognizant of that. But for some of the things that we work on in Made in Space, and the extraordinary robotics, the self-assembling satellite architectures, those aren't really qualified under ITAR, and yet there's still this kind of mortal fear that as soon as we look outside the boundaries of the United States, we'll run into that. So I have noticed, not necessarily at Made in Space, but throughout the industry, that's something that's almost this trauma coming down to us that is preventing us from looking outside of the borders. And there's just so much opportunity there.
Yeah.
That has yet to be explored. So that's all I can really say on that. But definitely a great question.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So Victoria, I want to come back to you, see if your audio is working there. Are you back with us?
Can you hear me now?
All right, we got you.
Excellent.
So I know that, I don't know if you still have the question, but let me just restate it. So one of the things we were talking to Jeffrey and Adrian about was this idea of, we've developed the space economy based on sort of national economics and national space agencies. And, you've worked in this space between nations for a long time, whether it's on the issue of missile deployments or nuclear issues. How do you see the international environment and sort of the potential for a more globalized economy in this space, and what's Secure World's role in that space? And then after we've heard from you, Diane, Dr. Howard, I am coming to you to ask about ITAR, because I know that Adrian raised it, so I'm coming your way in a second. So, but Victoria, talk to us about, and if you got something to say on ITAR, we'd love to hear it too, but I'm really interested about Secure World's role and how you see the global economy when it comes to space.
I wouldn't touch ITAR with a 10-foot pole. That's all Diane. So that's an interesting question, Jamil, because it's a real issue. Space is a shared domain. It's inherently universal. But when the way the national system is set up to handle these issues of universal interest, so to speak, is at the nation state level. The United Nations, it's literally in the name, nation. And so it's a real complicating factor when you're trying to get these cross-domain discussions like we have with space, with so many commercial actors playing a huge role in the stability and predictability of the environment. That's hard to get all stakeholders at the same table. And so that's what we really try to do at Secure World, is to bring together the various stakeholders to try and allow them to have discussions on these issues of common interest.
And before I go to Diane, I am interested in this point about bringing the stakeholders together. Is it your sense that there are sort of, when we talk about the cyber arena, there are sort of two camps, right? There's the sort of the US and European camp, and a view that we have on how cyberspace should be enabled. And then there's sort of a Russian and Chinese camp that have a different view that relates to how they want to deal with their domestic space. Is there a fundamental divide in the global community into camps about the way they think space ought to be utilized and the way we ought to enable the global economy? Or is there real commonality of purpose across the globe when it comes to space?
Well, I mean, it's difficult because a lot of countries don't have the resources to have a commercial space sector and a civil space sector and a security space sector. They have a space sector. It has to cover all issues. And most of them, you know, a lot of the new emerging state actors who are working on space, they're looking at it for how it helps life on Earth. So, you know, space for socioeconomic development, maybe so for a space for STEM development, that sort of thing. And so there's sometimes a sense of conflict or even a concern that having commercial actors sitting down at the table means that space is going to be monetized and it's going to be leaving the rest of the world out.
Right, that makes sense. So, so Dr. Howard, thoughts on how we might make the ITAR situation better for folks in like made in space and NanoRacks to sort of enable this capability? And beyond that, really, I'm also interested in your thoughts on as you're sort of clearing the regulatory thicket out of the way. You know, how do you see the business models for space economy? I'm going to ask the same question, by the way, of Jeff and Adrian, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the way that the Department of Commerce sees the business models in space. So what do you think? ITAR business models? Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Howard.
First of all, I'm not really going to jump all the way into the ITAR pool myself.
Fair enough.
I work for the Department of Commerce. So we've been working with state on export control. So you have ITAR, but you also have the things that fall to BIS under the EAR. And there's a lot, there's reform. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And I will say that I am mindful of some of these concerns, very articulately expressed by Jeff a little bit earlier, and the chilling effect that it can have on U.S. Commercial capabilities and industry, because we have really been involved in the regulatory reform for the commercial remote site sensing in the last year and a half's time. And that's been an incredible challenge. It's been a big win because we were able to put into the rule a tiered and much more permissive regulatory structure that's based on availability, but the implementation of that is a big challenge. What exactly does available mean? Available to who? How available? And so I think that we can't really just push the regulatory stuff out of the side because it is ongoing, and that's the whole idea of this availability. Available now doesn't necessarily, or available not available now doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be available in the near future. And that really should change and shift what we allow industry to do. Somebody mentioned fear a little bit ago. I'm not sure which of my colleagues on this panel said it, but I think that we really have to work to not let fear overtake us, to make sure that we have an understanding of what the long-term strategic objective is that we want to accomplish from a security standpoint, but also from a commercial standpoint. And there is that interrelationship. And then we need to make sure that the different incremental steps along the way are furthering us to get to that objective. So it's it is not something that's just done. It's something that's still going on. And I think that there are some, you know, as we've seen some things move from one list to the other. And I really think that we got it right when we started really looking at what exactly do we accomplish by limiting this commercial endeavor in the US? Does it really make a difference from a security standpoint? Does it really make a difference in the grand scheme of things internationally? And if it doesn't, then let's not let fear be the driver. Let's take a step back and figure out how do we meet and address that concern without, you know, cutting our nose off to spite our face, so to speak.
Right.
With that, I'll leave it to my esteemed colleagues.
That's great, Dr. Howard. Thank you, Jeff. What do you think about that? I mean, are we there? I want to get Adrian's thoughts on this too, but Dr. Howard says, look, we've still got a ways to go, right? And it's about finding this balance. But there are a lot of places where, you know, fear has driven our security policy, and that really we need this ability to move faster. And have we seen the flexibility that we needed? If not, where would you add flexibility to really sort of develop those business models for the space economy? And how do those business models interact with the way that the government regulates this space?
I mean, those are really loaded and great questions. I've been in the business a long time now, and I can remember when, as the commercial space community was truly just emerging in the 90s, the fear was of the Russians. And there was a lot of angst about involving them into our international economy and space. And I was present for some of the rules of the road on having the Proton come in. At that point, it was under ILS, run by Lockheed. To the victor belongs the spoils, I suppose. And so you know, every third step we made forward in an international business with the launch vehicles, there was someone saying, we cannot let the Russians in. Okay, and so you had that fear factor, while at the same time the folks working at commerce and the folks working in state and other places were trying to craft a genuine international market, and it's worked. Within reason, the Russian launch vehicles have been international competitors, and guess what? American innovation has come along, and one can argue whether we subsidize SpaceX, and that's maybe another discussion, right. But you know, but international competition, we have won out because of our innovation. Well, now, today, jump 20 years, and it's China. Do I get points for being the first to mention China, by the way? Do I get some?
You get the special award.
Okay, good. Dong. Okay, so today you see the same problem with the same fear. And you know, I go to these events, or that's the old days, I zoom into these events, and you know, they're saying, oh, we have the Chinese competition. We'll compete against them, for crying out loud. I mean, come up with rules of the road. You know, come up, you know, I'm sure the Chinese would gladly engage in true rules of the road. And if they don't go along with a level playing field, well, then fine. But engage them, and we're not engaging them. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly. I'm focusing on the fear factor, and it's been supplanted from Russia to China today. And at least we negotiated with Russia. We're not negotiating with China. On the business model, you know, gosh, the business models in space have matured in an extraordinary way in the last few decades. The public-private partnership with the U.S. government, which remains one of the most important customer, they truly have emerged the government as a customer. And, you know, hats off to the participants here who are from the government, who are struggling to try and make it more of a genuine relationship where you're purchasing services, where we in the private sector have skin in the game. So the business model, many of the business models have to assume government involvement. There are exceptions, we can get into that, but you know, you have to assume that the government, assume the government is a purchaser. And and so I don't know if I'm addressing your question, the business model, but we've seen the maturation of the business models, the business plans have matured, there's more liquidity, there's more capital in the game, there's more choices, and the government is a customer.
Well, I do want to talk to Adrian about these business models and dig in a little bit on that, but I do want to follow up on one point that you made about fear. So, you know, you made the point that the fear sort of shifted from the Russians to the Chinese today. Of course, we still have sort of questions now about the Russians, and we've seen some recent activities in space where Space Command has raised concerns about what the Russians are doing.
But not commercially. That's you're raising
that's
apples and oranges. I mean, that's I mean, we have I mean, so let me choose my words more carefully. I'm talking about an international rules of the road to allow space services on a commercial sector. What a sovereign nation does that we like or don't like is a completely different topic. Okay, and if one's solution is to try and prohibit any engagement with the space services and offerings of that nation, history has shown from the buggy car to space, it doesn't work. Okay, and so you raise a very germane point about actions that other sovereign nations have taken. I'm in the commercial space business. I want open opportunities among economically efficient players, and I want to compete, and I want to partner with and utilize when it's a level playing field.
Jamil, could I jump in here and add just a quick
Victoria, please.
On that?
Yeah, please.
I think Jeffrey makes an excellent point, and I just want to, foot stomp it a little bit. The reason why China started its space program is that the United States was concerned about a Chinese scientist working at JPL who had actually worked on the Manhattan Project, kept him under house arrest for a couple of years, and eventually he decided to go back to China, take his information with him, and he became the father of their space program, the nuclear program. Consistently, time and time again, I would say, out of concerns of security issues, overreact and then create the very situation we're trying to avoid. We saw in the 90s again, when there were concerns about Chinese espionage. We created the whole export control regime, which did very little to slow down China's program, but really kneecapped the US launch industry. And I feel we're going to be seeing it again if we keep acting that way. And so I'm always cautious. I understand there's security issues, but I think you need to recognize that taking action, sometimes any action is not better than no action.
Can I just raise one quick point I'd like your foot stomp. I like that. To foot stomp further, it's not just our perceived adversaries. You all may remember or forget Spadamage. The president of France came to see Jimmy Carter and said, and Jimmy Carter, I forget what it was, Iran or something, said, I have these remote sensing satellite images, but I can't show them to you. This is the president and prime minister of France at the time. And the guy was so ticked off, he went out and they created Spadamage. Okay, which has gone through different incarnations. But France apparently, I'm stretching out, got involved in a sophisticated way on satellite imaging when we didn't share with them. So the only point I'm making, I don't want to divert, but it's not only our perceived adversaries. When we hang on to this technology in a sovereign way, it comes out. And so that's probably a lot of folks disagree with that view, especially those in certain capacities in the government. But history has just shown that.
No, I do want to add to that. I mean, Jeff, you're making a good point here. We are reducing the size of our total addressable market when we think this way. And guess who's watching? Capital markets and investors are watching. And building a business model, building an economy is about building investments and building expectations.
Right.
And right now the expectation is that, this is an insecure domain and the rules of the road have not yet been laid out. So let's just wait. Let's keep our capital out of it, and we'll invest when we know the landscape a little bit better. So it's very problematic.
I'm just going to foot stomp the point that I made before about the fact that there are benefits to things taking a while, and one of the benefits to that process is that we can address these things as they come up, and we see it right now. I'll bring up the commercial remote sensing world once more, which is kind of further to your metaphor or your anecdote, Jeffrey. The idea that the implementation is where the real pain points are going to surface. And so that doesn't mean you walk away. And I think that we all need to be mindful of the fact that it isn't going to be an automatic process. But it again, I'll foot stomp another point of mine. And that is the reason that we have to really take a step back and look at what is the underlying goal that we're trying to achieve that underpins the decisions that are made from a regulatory standpoint. And what exactly, what outcomes do those things actually give us? Are we achieving our goal? And if not, how can we?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, Dr. Howard, and how you find that balance between sort of enabling commercial space while also protecting some of the valid security interests that are in play, right? I mean, I think even Jeffrey, you'd agree, right, that there are security interests in play here. It's not just that sort of we can sort of create a fully global space economy, let all the technology out, and just sort of let the market go where it may, right? There are security equities in play, without a doubt, right?
Well, yes, and just like in aviation, I mean, you have commercial and you have military and strategic, and so yes, of course. I take I push back when we're talking on a commercial level playing field, and then you raise an issue of a grave issue of perhaps a sovereign nation not behaving well in the field. And to me, it doesn't have anything to do with the commercial. It just, and let's be specific, the marketing of the Proton or Russia's involvement on the International Space Station, Russia going back in the Artemis program, the NASA program with us. To me, that has nothing to do with the issue that you raised. So that's where it just does. It's different. Tesla is opening in China, okay, and they're selling cars in China. What does that have to do with our concerns on the South China Sea? I mean, those are both legitimate questions, but to me, that to say to Tesla, do you say to Tesla, we're not going to let you sell cars because of what China's doing in the South China Sea? That gets into Olympic boycotts, that gets into all the issues that we have endured in this community. And so for me, those are separate issues.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, I think it's interesting, Dr. Howard, one of the challenges in this space is we've seen in the cyber arena, right? We've seen a lot of discussions about the overlap between commercial and national security. And, we've seen the administration here just in recent weeks and months take action against China in the commercial space on issues that raise security questions. It sounds like what I'm hearing from Jeff is that, we need to be very careful in the space arena about not overplaying that hand and not overplaying the security card. There are security issues that are legitimate, right? But it's also important to keep the commercial arena open to a global economy. Is that how commerce sees it also?
I have two things I want to bring up. One is that we're making a very good argument for why we keep the peaceful purposes of outer space separate from some of the security at the UN level, why first and fourth these are separate, and why there are things that happen in Vienna and things that happen in Geneva. The second point I want to make is we're also making an excellent argument for why we are transitioning the provision of space situational awareness data and the notifications from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce, and why we're working to make unclassed information available and available to all non-US government entities, because we do see this as a decoupled situation, and allow the security people to do what they need to do so that we can do what we need to do to enable the commercial world. And there's a definite link between a safer, more sustainable commercial space environment. Certainly it enables a whole lot on the defense side of things. There's a lot of reliance, but it makes for a much more viable economy on the ground, which also makes us stronger and better able to be secure. Yeah. So those are the points I wanted.
Makes sense. So Adrian, I want to come to you, then Victoria, over to you. So Adrian, one of the things we've been talking about as we talk about this viable space economy and the like is, that we're trying to generate sort of a demand for space-based or space-developed products and services, and we're seeing that increase over time. What do you see as the sort of future for the demand for both space-based and space-produced products? And what does that look like down the road in the future? I'm interested in Victoria's thoughts on the same question.
Oh, I love that question, Jamil. And you're really getting at something at the core of my philosophy and the philosophy of companies in kind of this weird sector where Made in Space finds itself, right? We don't address launch. We do build satellites, right? The Argonaut infrastructure. But it's really what we're doing is generating value in situ, right? Value in space or for Earth. It's not value coming from Earth. It's not a satellite beaming down an image of Earth to be used on Earth for terrestrial purposes. It is truly something that can only be done in space because of the unique environment or the unique resource complement that it offers. And that can be microgravity, radiation, lunar resources, things like that. So the answer to that, I think, is it's simple and complex. It's simple in the sense that we don't know yet. It's complex in the sense that we absolutely, everything that we've ever known, right, as a civilization, as a species, has been on this planet. The literal rest of existence is out there to explore. Every single time that we've invested in doing something extraordinary in the Apollo program, in the future in the Artemis program, we have made discoveries for how to use that unique environment of space for things that we couldn't possibly imagine. Right, so at Made in Space, of course, we're working on industrial crystal growth. We're working on Z-band optical fiber. I'm sure you guys know all about that and some of the incredible uses that high quality optical fiber can be put to. We've put our ceramics facility on the ISS now, so we assume for manufactured products that have terrestrial applications, there are going to be some really cool things that we can do to remove sedimentation. From ceramics, and that's great, and hopefully we'll all make a lot of money and I can retire with my boat. But really the point is here that continued investment will yield uses that on this call it wouldn't do to imagine what they are, right? They'll be science fiction to us if we look forward 10, 20 years. But we need to make those investments, and we need to make those investments as a country, as a species, knowing that every time we've done it, we've seen real results. We've changed the shape of our economy. Literally, the very shape of our economy has changed because of those basic investments. and they have real national security and economic implications. So I'll start with that general statement. We can drill down in any way that you want. I'm sure everyone has a lot to say. So,
well, Victoria, I want to come to you and ask about not just a question of sort of what the economy looks like for, or what the environment looks like for space-based and space-developed products, but also, you know, we've always talked about space sort of being the next big thing, right? And it's always sort of, you know, it's like quantum computing. It's always, you know, X number of years away. We're almost there. We're going to get there, right? Are we there now, or when is that moment going to come? And by the way, for the audience, I see a couple of questions in the chat box already. We're going to get to those here in just a few minutes. So please keep putting those questions in, and we'll come around to you in just a second. But Victoria, what do you think? I mean, are we at the point now where there really is a sort of space developed economy? Obviously, the space enables a lot of stuff terrestrially, but Adrian's talking about something fundamentally different, right? Really creating stuff in space and from space for terrestrial use. Are we there? Is that still, you know, 2-3 years out, 5 years out?
Yeah, I mean, I think people who work in space are inherently optimistic and excited about possibilities, and that's why you tend to get a lot of enthusiasm. It's like we're just about there. But I think and I know everyone always says these are strange and, you know, exciting times, but these really and truly are strange and exciting times for space. There's been a lot of discussion about things changing, but really in the last year, we've seen the launch of the mega constellations. We've seen satellite on-orbit servicing starting to be done, or you're seeing things being manufactured in space. And so you're really seeing how we use space evolving. But in terms of like the next stage where you're actively using space resources, I think we're still at the early stages of that. And that's why it's really encouraging that we're having these discussions about what does responsible behavior look like for people who want to work on the moon, which is what the Artemis Accords are. You have the Space Mineral Resource Working Group, which Secure World was a part of, that came up with building blocks of sort of guidelines we want to see for principles of behavior. And so for once, we have the option, the possibility of getting out ahead of the policies, getting out ahead of the technologies. But the problem you run into, of course, is that, as was implied by my other panelists, is that, you know, space may be a vacuum, but the politics of space do not occur in a vacuum. And so you have competition on the ground extending itself to competition on orbit near the moon. And so that makes it really challenging to come together and decide as a community what we want to see. Now, it's starting to be done. You know, we have the long-term sustainability guidelines, which Diane brought up, which there are 21 of them that the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, agreed to last year. And, you know, when you think about its consensus, which means that 95 countries agreed to it, that included the United States, that included Russia, that included China, that included Iran. You know, they all came together, agreed to it. So I think it is possible to come to this, but it's not going to be easy. And that's where we really need to have leadership and political capital being spent on making this a priority.
Yeah. So, Dr. Howard, I do want to ask you about this question about the Artemis Accords and these agreements that are sort of coming into play. Do we think these represent sort of what I think, as Jeff would describe it, sort of a new opportunity in this arena to really bring together a global economy? And Jeff, I'm going to come to you in a second, because I do want to talk about an issue that Victoria raised, this idea of competition on the ground turning into competition in space, and specifically since you raised China, I'm interested to talk about that. But Dr. Howard, to you, you know, do we see these accords and these agreements that are being made sort of as sort of finally that moment where we're reaching that consensus, we're getting documents and agreements in place? We had outer space treaties been around for a while, right? But these seem sort of different in nature. What's different about this moment when it comes to these international agreements?
Well, first of all, the Artemis Accords are based on the Outer Space Treaty. So I think, you know, most of the principles that are espoused in the Artemis Accords are foundational to the Outer Space Treaty. So there's this multilateral aspect of it. But what these principles do are that we say, we're going to go forward. This is building on our 2015 legislation that, you know, Title IV of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act said we recognize that, you know, the commercial sector can go and do things in space, harvest them, transport them, utilize them, make things out of them, whatever, and that this does not interfere with or violate any of our international obligations. And now this takes it a step further and says, and these are the principles that we're going to build upon. So kind of that long-term strategic thinking that I mentioned earlier, and transparency, interoperability, how we actually do some of that implementation from Article 9 in the Outer Space Treaty to deconflict our activities on the moon. So I think this is the next step. And I think there's certainly an awareness that the private sector has a role in these things. So I think that this is the beginning. This is what it looks like. We're saying, okay, we have this wonderful set of treaties, you know, the Core Four and the Outer Space Treaty, certainly, that set the tone. But a lot of things that we're doing now were not contemplated at the time of drafting and ratification. And now this is what it looks like to actually implement those principles and allow us to do these things that are so exciting and so aspirational. And yeah, I'm one of the enthusiasts, Victoria. And to answer that, I think that, are we there yet? We're certainly not where we're going to get, but we're definitely at the cusp of something that's different from where we've been before. And I mean, I know that Jeffrey has been at the cusp a few times of things, so I asked, do you get that sense that this is another you know, inflection point, if you will?
Yeah. So Jeff, what about that? Is this an inflection point, and are we really at this unique moment where these international agreements are finally coming together in a way that are sort of delivering on the promise of the Outer Space Treaty and creating this commercial marketplace? And as we talk about the commercial marketplace, you know, since you raised China, do we worry that the competition on the ground, as Victoria describes it, is becoming competition in space? And is that going to be a problem, or is that a benefit? Is that the kind of competition that generates new development and innovation, and as you talked about, or is the kind of competition that can be problematic and destructive and really make things harder as we sort of lock the economy down and sort of try to isolate it? How do you see this playing out, Jeff?
I counted 4 questions in there, but I'll do my best. Okay.
The compound questions we lawyers would call it.
Right. That's right. So first off, I've lived through, this is probably the 3rd inflection point that I've gone through in my space career. And each one, the stars align a little better. And this one is the most, I mean, you have, I mean, good God, you go back 15 years and the United States of America was dependent on the shuttle to get to space. What more does one have to say? Okay, I mean, what a mistake of execution of policy. And I remember when in the Senate, it came within 1 vote to force the Department of Defense to use the space shuttle and give up all ELVs. So certainly today, and I found myself in the very unique, you know, position of doing everything I could, far younger, to, you know, make sure DoD had access to ELVs rather than having to use the NASA space shuttle. So certainly today, with myriad ways to get to and from space and the ecosystem that's developing, and in-space services and all these sort of things, this feels different. It is different. And I like what Diane's saying, that, you know, we're not where we want to be, but we never will be where we want to be. So, but yes, it does feel difference. If I understand what you're saying about on the ground, you're asking the eternal question. Are you asking the eternal question of, are we in danger that the innovation on the ground disrupts space? I'm fascinated by that question, because every day we wake up and an innovation on the ground disrupts innovation products on the ground. And somehow the fact that the ground can disrupt space is somehow everybody runs for the hills, okay? Every day. I mean, the operative word here is innovation, okay? And we've suffered during the shuttle era, and this is changing, we get a data point, an N, every, make up a number, 5 years. Well, of course you're gonna get on the ground disruption in everything. Okay, today what's exciting is that we're coming close to the point where Moore's law is applicable to space. Okay, you're getting innovation. You're getting innovation in transportation. I think this decade is going to be the infrastructure decade, and we're going to see innovation in space stations, platforms, free flyers, whatever you want to call it in the English language. And you're going to see innovation in research, finally, the holy grail of many of us in this industry. You're going to see additive manufacturing come of age this decade in space. So you're going to see at times the ground disrupts space. You're going to see at times that space-based disrupts the ground, space-based disrupts space. And so I just, before, when you were driven solely by the government, one example of a ground-based disruption destroyed 5 PhDs, okay? And today you just got to shake it off. That's the way of the world.
Yeah. So Adrian, you know, I'm interested in one of the questions from the audience. This goes to a point that Jeff made, so I'm interested in Jeff and Dr. Howard and Victoria's thoughts on this also. But Adrian, you know, one of our audience members, Brendan Curry, asks, you know, are there terrestrial analogs that can be applied to space that are not protectionist? Is there a way to think about sort of space in a way that we can avoid this protectionism that Jeff, I think, correctly warns us about, but that are based on sort of things that we know about, that we think about here on the ground on Earth. Is there a way to think about space in that way?
Yeah, I love that question, and I'm gonna kind of blend it with the question that I really want to answer, which gets back to Victoria's.
Another lawyer tactic. It's a good lawyer
good
tactic.
point.
Answer the question you want to answer, not the question you were asked.
No, but it is an excellent question, and it brings up the analog that I've really wanted to discuss this entire time, which is infrastructure, and how strange I continually find the discourse to be in space surrounding space infrastructure. And how, it's all on the private sector, and how innovative the private sector is. And, every little Elon Musk out there is going to, figure out their own, program, and customers are just going to flock in, and then the government can buy services rather than, bespoke spacecraft or these billion-dollar programs. And to me, that discussion's, it's great. It's great that we can be having it as an industry finally, as Jeff is kind of insinuating. But it is still crazy to me how we fail to see every other bit of terrestrial infrastructure that has supported the terrestrial economy that is either state-sponsored outright or heavily collective in its nature.
The federal highway system.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Jamil. One thing I love to say at these things is it is not as if transcontinental truckers in the United States all came together collectively in the 50s and said, we really want to get oranges from California to New York in 3 days. That didn't happen. First of all, it was partially a defense decision that was made by the Eisenhower administration after observing, Nazi Germany in World War II and their highway system. Second of all, it was an economic decision to turbocharge the American economy, to herald the rise of the automobile, and to support economies all the way through the middle of the country between the coasts. I mean, highways are things we cannot even begin to quantify how many people's livelihoods, not just truckers, right? I use the example of truckers, but how many little communities depend on cars passing through with their gas stations, how many jobs, how many knock-on jobs and economies come from the massive government investment that keeps being done every single year in this infrastructure. So I want to just emphasize that, I'm an eternal optimist. This goes back to, Victoria's
point.
No, we absolutely do not have what we need. We are absolutely not, yet past that inflection point. This is, we are still not even in a nascent stage. We're in a pre-nascent stage in this industry. Because the infrastructure, all of the little assumptions along the way, the platforms that we need to build the things that we need to build in space, the return infrastructure, the automation that we need. Right now we do everything on the Z-band, the optical fiber, all that stuff. We do it on the space station. Well, in the future, we absolutely need robotically maintained long duration platforms with available volume inside, and who's not going to invest in that? One private company that doesn't see a direct return in 10 years because the market that they need to show the returns hasn't developed yet, because that market needs infrastructure to even begin investing in the first place, right? So this is such a, it's not a chicken and egg scenario, right? I hate the term. The chicken is, large collective sustainable investments in infrastructure. The egg is a sustainable economy. Maybe don't quote me on that one. It was a little bit tortured, but hopefully you get what I mean.
So I do. So Dr. Howard, I'm interested in this point. So, we talked earlier about the security and commercial overlap, and one of our questioners notes the dual use nature that causes this challenge, right? But isn't, as Adrian lays out, isn't there the flip side of that, which is there are potential real security benefits of building a space infrastructure, the kind that Adrian describes, that can create massive economic benefits also, the same way the interstate highway system does. Is there thought being given in the Commerce Department to doing this? And how does the Commerce Department envision sort of that over the next 4 years, regardless of which administration might be in place? do we imagine that that's sort of something that we might be able to do as a nation, or even working as an international community to build that sort of capability in outer space, that infrastructure?
So first, let me make the point that I think that there is a profound security interest in innovation, for sure, across the board, because we just to be stale or to do things as we've always done them. I think, you know, the shuttle is a good example of how that can be a problem, especially when every 5 years you get your N. So first, let's start with that. I can't speak for the entire Commerce Department. I mean, you're putting a lot of pressure on me here, but I will tell you that some of the things that Adrian's talking about from an infrastructure standpoint are the things that we're thinking about as we've been developing the early stages of the open architecture data repository. So part of the infrastructure of which allows all of these things to continue to happen is a safe and sustainable space environment. And part of that is space situational awareness. So we, in building the open architecture data repository, which will allow us to improve space situational awareness and also improve some of the space traffic management services that are provided, we're very mindful of the role of government in this and what exactly should be provided. So Space Policy Directive 3 talks in terms of providing a basic service to the user at no cost. And this is something we really truly do believe in, and that also requires that we do some data buys. So, you know, because we need to support the innovations that are occurring in the space traffic, space situational awareness and space traffic, space safety. We'll just call them all space safety industries. And in order to do that, we also, in putting together this infrastructure that we're building, we want that element of R&D to continue. We want like a fertile space where that can happen. Maybe it won't be forever. Likely it won't be forever, but so how do we exactly even define what basic service is now? Certainly it's going to be different even in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And then how do we continue to facilitate, to enable, to make those innovations percolate? And how do we not get in the way of industry?
Right.
Because there is already a viable space safety industry, and we can't compete with them. We don't want to compete with them. That would be, first of all, that's against our legislative mandate in our 50702 legislation, where we aren't allowed to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we do advocate for industry. So those are the questions that we're looking at. I'll let you all know, we are planning Industry Day. I believe it's going to be right before Thanksgiving. And we are, you know, it'll be in the Federal Register, and we will be speaking with anybody and everybody who's interested in figuring out these kinds of questions on what is basic service, how can we provide basic service and continue to define it in a way that includes the R&D that comes from FFRDCs and academia and industry itself. And how do we let this be a nimble enough platform that it can evolve as the innovations continue? And that is a definite link to security. I mean, all of that allows DoD to do what it needs to do. Some of the things that percolate within our open architecture data repository certainly will be things that benefit the security world as well as the commercial world. And so that's what we're doing.
Yeah. So Victoria, what do you think about that? I mean, obviously there's a real opportunity here, both with space situational awareness, but also on the infrastructure front that Adrian was talking about, to potentially, you know, have government involvement to create the capability, you know, whether it's through these, through the data buys and provision of basic services. Are there other things that government and that perhaps the international community could do coming together to create the kind of infrastructure that Adrian's talked about? And Jeff, I'm coming to you with a similar question, and on the question of whether one of our audience members asked whether we'll be seeing commercial space station anytime soon. But Victoria, thoughts on that question?
Yeah, plenty. I mean, because I think what it comes down to a certain extent, part of space is a public good. And so because this is a public good, that means governments are going to have a responsibility for ensuring that it's accessible and predictable and sustainable over the long term. And that part of that is also making sure it's usable, and that's where the infrastructure element comes in. I think SSA is an interesting case study because, you know, to a certain extent, you need to have SSA for flight safety. So there's a public good element to it. But then you have the commercial SSA operators, providers coming in and giving more exquisite and complicated SSA, and that could be used to be purchased to do more activities in space, whether you're doing, you know, some sort of rendezvous and proximity operations and on-orbit servicing or debris removal or that sort of thing. And so I think there's certain levels where the government provides the base level, and then that allows industry to build upon that. And the problem is that for certain things like debris removal, we don't see, for example, the U.S. government taking a lead on that, you know, providing that base level. There is no U.S. government entity in charge of figuring out what to do about active debris removal. But that seems like a big issue, considering how, you know, we're having all these new satellites coming in orbit, we're having all this new debris being created. And so I think that's really what we need to see is, again, having that starter point from the government, and allows industry to build up on that in order to make sure that you have the stability that allows the infrastructure to feel confident that it can be built and be around for long term. You're not going to have a company putting its satellite up in orbit and getting taken out. I always think of one last thing. You know, a couple of years ago, Ecuador had its first satellite being launched, and almost immediately was taken out by a piece of space debris. You know, so you don't have to have created the debris or the instability of the space domain to be affected by it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So Jeff, one of the questions coming from our audience members asked whether we'll be seeing a commercial space station anytime soon, and I think it's sort of related to Victoria's point about, you know, this question about whether we need sort of a larger infrastructure that's more sustainable and not solely reliant on the private sector or commercial interests. What's your thought on that, on those two sort of points?
You know, I speak publicly a fair amount of time, and one of the points that I like to make is the previous decade, we the United States, you know, spent billions to assure as routine access to and from space as any nation has ever had. And it was successful. And, you know, hats off to everybody that today there is a vibrant launch vehicle community. And now my expectation is that this decade is the decade of, as I said earlier, of infrastructure development. The destination's going to become important. And so first, you know, one can assume that there will be myriad destinations by the end of the decade. The former head of Boeing predicted that by the end of the decade, there'll be 10 or 12 private space stations. Yeah. And, you know, first, you know, I said earlier, it's strange in our language, we have space stations, free flyers, platforms. To us in the industry, there's a subtle difference between all of them. I'll just say space stations or something in general. But we really do see at NanoRacks, we're focused on the outpost program, the reuse of upper stages instead of using them as discarded space junk. But, you know, we're working on various contracts now to look at first thing is Mars Demo 1 going up in June of next year with SpaceX. And when the mission finishes at the Falcon, they're going to be doing robotic testing to understand how you cut into metal. And we see that as the first step to reusing the second stage. Right. And so we think there'll be a lot of space stations over the next 10, 15, 20 years. What's exciting is the first ones, let's say it's free flyers, the first ones will be in the ISS vicinity. But I was talking to a senior government official about a year ago, and he was like, Jeff, where would you want to put your second free flyer? And I said, co-located with the Chinese. And he almost fell off his chair, and everybody in the room just went like this. And then they started to think. I said, why are you ceding that orbit to the Chinese? You know, and right now we're in the Russian orbit, for those of you old enough to remember, and those of you old enough to remember, I'm partially responsible for why the ISS is not in the space shuttle 28 degrees orbit, but it's in the higher 51-degree Russian orbit. So why, you know, why are we in that orbit? Why don't we have free flyers that build up an ecosystem with the Chinese? Let's call the bluff, okay? And so I think we're going to be in a decade where we're going to see a myriad of destinations. It's going to keep the ecosystem going on transportation. It's going to, and you'll be able to do in-space manufacturing and all the other services that companies like Made in Space want. So I think it'll be a very exciting decade.
Yeah. So we've got a couple more questions from the audience, and I'm going to turn to closing remarks from all of you. So be thinking about what you might be thinking about, where you see the space economy going in the next 5 to 10 years. But one of our anonymous attendees asked the question about, you know, while we don't want to be protectionists, we do want to protect the advances that we're making as a participant in this space, and not just a shaper of the marketplace, but actually a participant in the marketplace. So what are the opportunities specifically to better cyber securitize, right? To bring better cybersecurity to commercial players, particularly at the R&D and deployment phases. So Adrian, I'd love your thoughts on that, and Victoria, same to you. Adrian, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Let me see. Go to Victoria first. I want to give that one a little more thought.
So Victoria, thoughts on how you might better cyber securitize some of the commercial players in the space, particularly in the R&D phase. You know, one of the concerns, at least in the broader industry, is, you know, as we move to an innovation economy here in the United States, right? If all of our R&D is going out the back door to other countries, you know, and we'll leave it fairly obvious as to which major country is a player in this space. We all know who it is. Victoria, do we worry about that in the space industry? And if so, what can we do to better enable better cybersecurity for the young startup players in the space?
I think, first of all, it needs to be a priority for them. I spoke at a conference a few years ago where it's mostly emerging space actors, i.e. space startups. And I was talking specifically about cybersecurity, and the audience got mad at me because they said, you know, we've got all these other things to think about. What you're talking about, it's such a minimal possibility of risk. Why should we worry about that? I'm like, guys, it's a threat. But I think the recent SPD3, the Space Policy Directive 5 that just came out a few weeks ago, that talks about cybersecurity for space issues, that's a good first step in terms of saying, okay, from the get-go, from the very beginning, from the earliest part of your supply chain, you need to build cybersecurity in. I think that's a shift in how cybersecurity is approached. It's not something you do if you feel like it, or if you invested a certain amount of money. It's like, no, it is fundamental to making sure you can still use those space capabilities over the long term. So I'm hopeful that it will be taken and run with. We'll see what actually happens. Like I said, it's still early. The directive was just released a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, Adrian?
Yeah. So from my end, I mean, take advantage of all of the government services. I mean, we you know, I've worked on a number of contracts with the DoD where you know, there are very clear and very transparent, you know, services of assistance available to ramp up kind of early stage cybersecurity awareness, cybersecurity programs, vetting, you know, systems vetting. And so we've found the government to be a very willing partner in cybersecurity, especially now. So in my advice, I mean, especially for smaller companies where IT infrastructure is like the third or fourth thing that they're thinking about, especially since space is so capital intensive. It's not, you know, our value isn't locked up completely in network or in that kind of softer, you know, human to human infrastructure. It's locked up in machines and designs and plans that are stored on those networks. You know, take advantage of the services that are out there. There are plenty. Yeah, that's where I would really start.
Jamil, can I just say something? I want to use the opportunity among the 60 or so folks that are listening in as a warning. At NanoRacks, we're seeing something a little different. I'll be very quick on this. As our name's getting out, we are getting offers from organizations to help us write our DoD proposals. And as we dig in, some of them have offices in other countries. So I want to just take this moment to say to folks out in the audience, if you get, no offers to, if it's too good to be true, I mean, to dig in a little bit. This isn't cybersecurity. This is just plain New York smarts here. We have found several organizations that when we trace them back, their main office was in another country. And they are offering to write our proposal. So there's no cyber need invasion. There's no, I mean, we would be handing over to them everything we're working on. So this is just a warning to the folks on this that we're concerned at NanoRacks. We've spoken to some of our colleagues at DoD. If someone you don't know approaches you in office to write the proposal, dig in. Some are legitimate and some are not.
Right. Dr. Howard, one of our questions.
I have one last point about the cyber.
Oh, please. No, please, yes.
Just prior, well, about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, NIST came out with a cybersecurity framework. And NIST is another part of the Department of Commerce. So that's something else that really gives somebody new to the field or new to thinking about this aspect of what they've been doing, something that they can, kind of really work with. And it's available online.
Yeah. No, that's a really important point. I was going to ask one of our last questions from the audience to you, Dr. Howard. One about this idea of a space commodities exchange and whether sort of there's an opportunity to enable that. And then second, is there really a commercial market today for Space Force to protect at this point? So those are the two questions we have left from the audience.
Well, I mean, we have a very viable commercial space industry that's going on in space. If there's something to protect, I think it's, you know, certainly we've been protected for a long time by the work of the 18th and other things that we may not be at liberty to discuss here. So yes, I think that there is a role for Space Force in all of that. What was the other part of the question?
This question of this commercial commodities exchange. Yeah.
So yes, actually, there has been a lot of discussion between our office and a group of people, and the DoD is involved in this as well. With regard to a space commoditization index. I'm not sure where it is right now. That's not part of the portfolio that I work on, but it is under discussion and it's made movement, and it's an extremely interesting initiative, you know, even figuring out just what would be included in this space commoditization index. And I think it really kind of shows that this idea is maturing. So yes, that's under discussion. I don't know much about it.
Thanks, Dr. Howard. So what I'd love to do is now, you know, in the 10 minutes we have left, and we will end right on time at 15 past the hour for the audience. I'd like to get your all's thoughts on the way you see the space economy going over the next 5 to 10 years. And in particular, you know, what can we learn from sort of history, right? And these new frontiers, right? Is there an analogy like the Homestead Act for space? Are we going to see sort of the British East India Company for space? Is that going to be, you know, NanoRacks or Made in Space, or, you know, name your other company? I mean, how do we see this market playing out over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the things we should be concerned about? What are the things we should be excited about, as Victoria said earlier? And by the way, if you're wondering how I get all these really interesting questions, it's not me. It's Joshua Huminski, the director of the Mike Rogers Center at the Center for the Study of Space, the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So the team there, Dan Mahaffey, the whole team is terrific. But that's where all these great questions are coming from. It's not my own innovation here. So we'll start with Dr. Howard, if it's all right. Where do you see the economy, since it's your department that's helping drive this thing, clearing the regulatory thicket out of the way? You're the chief counsel. Tell us about how you see this playing out over the next 10 to 15 years.
Well, I think I sort of started my remarks with how I think it's going to play out. I think it's an ongoing process, and I think, you know, we're headed toward the $1 trillion space economy. How we, the analytics that we use to determine just what it consists of, those are undergoing some examination right now, and will continue to evolve. I think that the workforce also, our understanding of just what the workforce entails, and I might say that both Made in Space and NanoRacks are employing former students of mine from, you know, a transdisciplinary program to kind of help the workforce be not just aerospace engineers and people that are policy people, but a very wide array of skill sets. And I think we're going to see that evolution continue. I think that we have some very good analogs. You know, the International Space Station is a very good one. We've talked a lot about competition, but in space, there's been competition since the International Geophysical Year, which, you know, spawned Sputnik and also Explorer 1. And at the same time that we've had that competition, we've also had a lot of collaboration. That's the beauty of science. You know, we have a lingua franca, and it allows us. And so I think that we've seen that competition and also collaboration and cooperation, especially since we are inherently international when we talk about space. I think that's going to continue, and I think that there's a lot of hope in there.
Muted. Jeff, 2 minutes on your thoughts on where we see the economy going over the next 5 to 10 years in this space.
I gave a talk in Japan a couple years ago, and in doing that, I did a little research on how the American government has always approached frontiers versus other countries. And I was shocked to learn that the concept of the government investing in new companies, whether it's Mr. Boeing and Mr. Northrop and Mr. Grumman on their planes, and giving them postal routes that were not necessary but built up the industry, that is unique. I found out out that in the trains, when they went out to the far west, the catalogs for Sears Roebuck were able to be carried for free so that the settlers would be able to order things which would increase the traffic on the railroads. And I said this to the Japanese and other examples to the Japanese audience, and they were dumbfounded. They were shocked about how much this nation, what would be the cost of an airplane ticket if we had to pay for the airports and the air traffic controllers. So the role of the public-private partnership between the government and entrepreneurs is a great American tradition. Moving forward, my concern, I'll be real blunt and I'll add something here. We haven't talked about a lot of the advances that have been made in the last 4, 5, 6 years. One of my concerns is, have we politicized the space program? Is the Space Force too political? If there's a change of administration, I worry about that. I worry that space is going to be seen as a Republican effort, and a whole nother panel can be devoted to the strategic, how the entrepreneurs meet the strategic needs. But you asked about concerns. That's one of my concerns. As for NanoRacks and our contributions moving forward quickly, we are agile, we are small, we are economically efficient, and we're sophisticated. And so we're contributing to some of the needs in the ecosystem and the government, but the government still moves too slowly, and we got to solve that. And that's all I did. Thank you.
Thanks. Adrian, 2 minutes on where you see this going over the next 5 to 10 years. Then Victoria, over to you for the last word.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll do my usual Jekyll and Hyde approach and start with the pessimist and end with the optimist. The pessimist in me says that we continue to get caught up in analogies in this industry about how we're just like Silicon Valley and all it takes is a couple of guys in a garage, though no offense, NanoRacks, I know that's how NanoRacks started and that's awesome. But a couple of guys in a garage with a couple of computers and suddenly they're billionaires. That's not how the space industry works. Under no circumstances, this is a capital-intensive industry where small companies take massive amounts of risk, and they cannot take that risk, or they won't even be willing, their investors won't be willing to allow them to take that risk without guarantees of some return or guarantees of some safety of that investment. That's one of the biggest hurdles that we face as an industry. My next concern, mass consolidation. We've got to get away from this idea of successful exits being, meaning that we're bought up for 100 million or 200 million or $1 billion by the next biggest guy, because that's what gave us the environment that we have today. It's not good for competition. We need to keep promoting the little guy and innovative approaches with what Jeff was talking about, public-private partnerships that are intentionally and intelligently targeted by people in the government, in the public space, that have the concerns of American national security and the well-being of the sustainable American economy at heart. Looking forward, and this is the hopeful side of me, but we have a choice to make today, right? This is hopeful, but there is no guarantee that this will happen. My hope is for a future where real value is generated in space for use on Earth and for furtherment of human exploration and human settlement in space and beyond cislunar eventually. Specifically, that involves platforms that are initially publicly funded and publicly supported, eventually privately owned and operated. But just like the Postal Service, right? We cannot make the same mistake. The word is in the name, the Postal Service. It is not the Postal Corporation. It is not the Postal, whatever. It is a service. It is a public service. It is not there to make a profit. It is there to allow other people, organizations to make a profit on its back. Yeah. That's what highways do. That's what the Postal Service does. All of these services that we've agreed are part of this economic infrastructure. We need to start thinking about space that way, or we'll end up in where we have been for the past few decades.
Gotcha. Victoria, you have the last word.
It's a lot of pressure there. I'll try and be quick. 2 main points I want to make really quickly is that when we're talking about the future of the space economy, vocabulary matters. And so I'd like to point out that there are a lot of people around the world that are concerned about being left out. And that, when we talk about, for example, the British East India Company, that basically sucked India dry of all its riches that it had. the Homestead Act basically took away a lot of land from Native Americans. And why does this matter? It's because the US does not own space. The commercial sector does not own space. It's there, it's a domain, we have to figure out how to share it. And it doesn't mean that there can't be investment. I support the space economy, but just recognize that there are consequences to using vocabulary that has a historical taint to it. The other thing I'd like to point out is that rules and regulations are not bad words. What I found really encouraging is that the commercial sector has taken it upon itself to do some self-regulations over the past year. We've seen the Space Safety Coalition, we've seen Satellite Industry Association come out with commercial spaceflight safety rules. There's a consortium, CONFERS, the Consortium for the Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, that talks about honorable servicing, best practices from the commercial sector. And so I think it's encouraging, and this is a recognition that there need to be some boundaries and some predictable behavior that we can get from these agreed upon rules and regulations, or even regulations coming on from the government side. And so I think there's a way to move ahead and really have a cooperative approach to make sure that space is accessible and usable to all of it long term.
Thanks, Victoria. Thank you to Dr. Howard, Jeff, Adrian. I really appreciate you all being here with us, Victoria, today. I want to hand it over to our partner, Congressman Glenn Nye. Thank you so much for your partnership, Congressman Nye, and to give us a few words as we close out today.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their hard-earned thoughts and expertise with us today. Thank you to Jamil for very capable moderation of an interesting discussion. Let the discussion continue in our future sessions. And also shout out to Joshua Huminski, the director of the Mike Rogers Center at CSPC, for managing this program. Thanks also to Dan Mahaffey for his very capable leadership and support. And I want to thank all those who tuned in and joined us. Dan posted in the chat the link to our YouTube page where this will be posted for review and sharing for those who couldn't attend today. So thank you all for being with us. It was a pleasure for us to host this excellent conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.